Question 1. Explain how U.S. imperialism worked in 1970 compared to Lenin, what he described in 1916, and then explain how the OEA described in 1969 used capitalism and imperialism to conquer markets from within. And so, U.S. imperialism in 1970 worked differently than Lenin had described in 1960, as Lenin believed that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, where rich countries controlled weaker ones through their colonies, their military force, and their political domination. And so they took these resources and ruled governments openly. Whereas by 1970, imperialism was more indirect. Like the U.S. didn't need to invade countries, they controlled it through their economies. And so multinational corporations, foreign investment, and loans let the U.S. Shape Latin America's economies. So mostly industries like mining, agriculture, and oil were mostly in foreign hands, taking wealth out while leaving the local people poor. Now, the Organization of American States in 1969 called this approach the conquering markets from within. And so, instead of armies, the U.S. used money, businesses, and influence over local elites to dominate the markets. Question 2. Please describe how and why Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico dictatorships offered their services to the U.S. empire. And so during the 1960s and 1970s, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico acted as partners of the U.S.'s empire. And these regimes were military or authoritarian governments that maintained strict control over their populations and opposition. And so they offered their services to the U.S. by protecting U.S.'s economic interests in their own countries. And so this meant that they allowed U.S. companies to control industries like mining, oil, and agriculture, suppressing labor movements and preventing reforms from that could challenge foreign influence. And so these dictatorships benefited them as well, as they ended up receiving military aid, economic backing from the U.S., and political support, which basically strengthened their power and allowed them to somewhat stay in control. Question 3. Describe how the Monetary International Fund and World Bank operated in Latin America, and explain what these organizations of good demanded when Fidel Castro reached into them with a vicious circle of strangulation they incited in the region. And so the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank operated in Latin America, giving loans to government and businesses. And so on the surface, this was seen as a way to help these countries with their infrastructure, industry, and modernize their economies. However, these loans came with strict conditions, so these countries had to prioritize paying their debt back, open their markets to foreign companies, and often cut off their social programs. And so when Fidel Castro turned to these organizations, they refused to cooperate with because Cuba had resisted the U.S.'s influence and economic control. And so Galeano calls this the vicious circle of strangulation. Now, in Latin America, countries became dependent on loans, which increased their debt. Now, to pay off this debt, they had to export more raw material. They had to import expensive finished goods, and they had to follow the economic rules set by the IMF and the World Bank. Now, this cycle continuously kept the regions economically dependent, and helped stop them from becoming independent and having any type of development. Question 4. Please explain the dynamics that A. Emanuel argued about the curse of low prices in Latin America compared to the U.S. and Europe. And so E. Emanuel explains the curse of low prices in Latin America. He was basically arguing that Latin America countries mainly exported raw materials like coffee, sugar, and minerals. And so because these products were sold cheaply on world markets, it was hard for them to they gained very little from it. Whereas in the U.S. and in Europe, they sold finished goods like machines, electronics, manufactured products, which they priced up a lot higher. Now this meant that rich countries were benefiting a lot more wealth from this trading. And so while this was happening, Latin America was continuously staying poor. And Emanuel basically talks about how it wasn't just bad luck, it was a structural problem that kept Latin America undeveloped and dependent. And it made it very hard to catch up with these industrialized nations while they were selling much more expensive goods. Question 5. Finally, explain the case affecting coffee and car manufacturing industries in Brazil. And so Brazil, the coffee and car industry show how the U.S. economic influence worked in practice. So for coffee, Brazil was a major exporter, and the issue was that the international prices kept them low, and so most of the process was just getting sent back to the U.S. instead of actually returning it back to the Brazilian farmers. And so this was an example of the curse of low prices, because while they were exporting raw materials, they ended up earning little money from it, and it just kept Brazil dependent on these other richer countries. Now, for the car industry, the U.S. companies built factories in Brazil, and they were controlling production. And while this brought in new jobs and technology, it also meant the profits were being sent back to the U.S. and local industries couldn't fully develop independently. And so Galeano is basically explaining that in both cases, Brazil's economy was able to appear modernized, but most of the wealth just was extracted by foreign powers, and it just like once again left the country dependent and underdeveloped. The sixth question asks, what are Black police and necropolitical Black governance according to the author? Please explain the concepts and how do they fit within the overall conversation of the article. Now, do you agree with Alves that the law cannot go to certain places, that the law decides not to go, or that the law decides not to go to those certain places? Why? Please provide one example. And so Alves describes Black policies as urban spaces where Black and marginalized communities live under extreme poverty, neglect, and violence. And so these areas are usually ignored and abandoned by the state. And necropolitical governance is basically the idea that the government decides who lives safely and who is basically like left to die and like fight for themselves. Now, it's sort of a control through abandonment and violence rather than support. And now these conflicts show how state power operates selectively, and that certain populations are just neglected fully. And so I agree with Alves when in which like the law often does neglect not to go to certain areas. And one of the examples I can think of is that in many favelas in Brazil, police rarely intervene consistently through like the violent crimes, and it's not really because they cannot. It's because like the state intentionally avoids these spaces, and like they choose not to go there. And I think that it itself is kind of disturbing because it leaves a lot of residents like vulnerable. Question 7. Explain the following concepts according to the book Maccabee Specialties and the Letting Die Policy, and if you see any connections with the realities of Brazil and the U.S. and how the government treats non-white low-income people. And so in Alves' work, Maccabee Specialties refers to this space where violence, death, and fear live within live in everyday lives for people. And so this is more specifically in marginalized communities, and they're areas where the state's presence is mostly violent, like police raids, but there is little there's little protection or security. And so the letting die policy is basically where the government doesn't always directly kill people, but instead allows certain population, especially in poor non-white communities, to live in conditions where death is more likely to happen. And so this can be through this whole process could be through neglect, lack of service, and selective policing. Now, with that, you can see there's similarities between Brazil and the United States, because these both places have non-white and low-income communities where they face over-policing when it comes to force, but under protection when it comes to resources and safety. And so, for an example, in the United States, a lot of low-income Black communities experience heavy police presence, but still lack investments for schools, healthcare, and infrastructure, which we can see clearly is also happening in Brazil. But it's also are both really important problems that aren't talked about enough. Question 8. What is your overall take or impression of Alves' article in relation to the dynamic state police and favela people? Well, I think my overall impression of Alves' article is that it shows an unequal relationship between the police, the state, and the people living in the favelas. I mean, instead of protecting these people, the state often controls and chooses to neglect them. And so the police, they're treating residents like they're a threat, and the government is basically failing to provide basic services to these people. And there's just a cycle of violence and poverty that shows that some communities are valued less than others. And I just don't think that whole entire thing is fair, like, at all. So question 9 asks us, what is your take on all of these 5 elements functions with each other to explain the movie? And so my take is that all 5 systems work together to show a broken system. In Elite Squad, Bope sees its mission as bringing order, but it operates with extreme violence. And so at the same time, regular police are corrupt and poorly trained, which makes the system unreliable. And so drug cartels are growing stronger, as with this in favelas, because of this weak system and corrupt policing. Meanwhile, the wealthier societies are also playing a role, as they are creating a demand for drugs, but are somehow they stay out of the violence, and they're disconnected from the violence. And so overall, the movie is just showing that the problem isn't just crime; it's the whole system where corruption, inequality, and violence reinforce each other. So. Question 10. Captain Nascimento says Pope enters the favela to kill, not to be killed. What is your take on the comment? And who do you think Pope is ultimately really protecting? And so in the Elite Squad, Captain Nascimento says Pope entered the state to be killed, not to be killed. And I think it shows how extreme and violent their mindset is. And it basically is just suggesting that residents are seen only as enemies, not citizens, and which justifies their use of force. And so I think Pope is ultimately protecting the state and wealthier society, not the people of the favelas. And that their actions focus on controlling those areas and maintaining order for others, rather than actually keeping these favela communities safe.